Hello, everybody. Surprise live stream. We were just thinking this morning, we were like, you know what? Given the timeliness and everything, we have to just go live right now.
I mean, there's so much that is still undecided, results continuing to come in, so it didn't make sense to hold it, so here we are.
It's a fun time. We're here. Got 4 hours of sleep. It's okay. We love you guys literally that much. So what does that mean? What's going on right now? I mean, that is the ultimate question. But before we start, I just want to say, again, thank you all so much to our premium subscribers, many of whom are watching right now, who enabled our stream last night. It cost a hell of a lot of money in order to put that whole production on, to have people on the ground in Pennsylvania, Ryan and Emily here, to have counterpoints 2 days a week this time, and really just shows you, like, look, we got to gear up for 2024 because it is going to be an amazing election. An amazing show for the next 2 years. We have a special discount going on right now by special request. People wanted us to keep it, so we've got a 10% annual discount right now, going on right now for 10% off. The link is in the chat and in the description of this video. It really helps us build for 2024 and so much more. Again, we cannot thank everybody who helps us put this show on enough, to pay our crew as well, who was in the control room, many of whom did not sleep very much last night. So we're very thankful. Just at the top before we even get into the elections.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. You guys are amazing. People seem to love the stream. It was a blast doing it. Yep. You know, it was really fun to have Kyle and Marshall. I thought Ryan and Emily did a wonderful job, you know, picking up when we went home to get a few hours of sleep. Not that I could really sleep because I was still thinking about all of this.
I was so buzzed. Yeah.
I know. I didn't even take any caffeine or anything. I just was like, oh, this is so crazy. What's happening now? Or is there a new batch of votes from Maricopa County or whatever?
I know.
So anyway, the kind of plan for the show, it's obviously going to be a little more freewheeling, but we are going to go through what our top takeaways are here at the top. We're going to take a look at where things stand with the Senate, where they stand with the House, which, crazy enough, still in doubt which party is going to have control of the House. Did not see that one coming. We're going to take a look at the key governor's races, some of those still outstanding. We're also going to dig into the ballot initiatives. And then we want to take a look at, you know, what does all of this mean for 2024? Because there are a lot of big takeaways for Biden. There's a lot of big question marks about Trump. And certainly a wonderful night for Ron DeSantis. Could not have played out better for him personally. So we'll tell you what we think basically happens next. So just to start at the top, here's basically the lay of the land. The red wave, I'll steal from Ben Shapiro. I don't often quote Ben Shapiro, but he said
we can quote him in this instance.
The red wave turned into a red wedding.
Game of Thrones reference for the uninitiated.
I mean, listen, Republicans still likely to hold the House, but as I said, actually in doubt. As of this morning, in terms of races that are called, they have only netted overall 1 seat. That is way below where they expected to be at this point. I mean, I never thought we'd be going into this morning not sure of where the House is ultimately going to land.
Absolutely correct.
In terms of the Senate, big news overnight, John Fetterman declared victorious in the state of Pennsylvania. That means Democrats are actually up a seat because that was a Republican-held seat. He outperformed Biden in effectively every part of the state. There's a lot to say about that. We'll save that for a moment. What's still outstanding? You still have Nevada, where you have a lot of Clark County mail-in ballots. Nobody knows how much still outstanding. Right now, the Republican has an edge. Will he ultimately hang on there? Big question mark. In Arizona, it looks like Mark Kelly is going to hold on there. He's got a pretty sizable margin based on what we know about where the votes are still out. Looks like he's going to be able to pull it off. Georgia, Warnock has now pulled into a lead, but is below that 50% threshold to avoid a runoff. Now, there is some vote still outstanding. There is a still theoretical possibility he could get beyond that 50% vote. But if that one, let's just say that one heads to a runoff, then you're looking at Nevada and Arizona. Republicans have to hang on in Nevada, which they might, in order to gain control of the Senate. So you have some really, you know, wild situations here, and much, much better night than Democrats expected. You know, a lot to say about how this was a sort of repudiation of the Trump direction of the Republican Party. A lot to say about how this was really a result of Roe versus Wade being overturned and incredible Democratic enthusiasm, very unusual for a midterm election. And the last thing I'll say, Saagar, and then I'll get your sort of like big picture takeaways, and I'll give mine. You did have regional variation
Very
in
much
how
so.
these results unfolded, which made this election so weird because the first results we got in were Florida, and it was like, oh my God, this looks like the red wave bloodbath. Then we start getting in New Hampshire, and we're like, wait a second, Maggie Hassan is dramatically outperforming Joe Biden in New Hampshire, dramatically outperforming the polls. Then you had New York also was kind of strong for Republicans, not as good as they thought they were going to do there, but they actually picked off a few Democratic seats there. So a lot of regional variation, a lot of like candidate variation, a lot going on that made this a very complex election night.
Absolutely. So a couple of top line things. Number one, obviously the red wave did not materialize in any way. And to be clear, House and Senate still very much could go Republican, given the outstanding results right now in Arizona and in Nevada. But I think regardless of that, given how the toss-ups in the House, which we will get to in a little bit, did not go in the Republican direction, given really the fact that the Democratic base showed up big time, this is one of the most extraordinary midterm elections absolutely of my lifetime and in modern history. Joe Biden has just shored up his position at the Democratic base. This changes politics on a macro level in a way that nobody anticipated. I can say that. And I will say also that given the national environment that we are in right now, the Republican, quote, soul searching and civil war, which I did not think would materialize, I still think it absolutely will now at this point, and will go frankly into overdrive in the next 2 weeks, especially if Trump also does announce his election. But I have to also say this on abortion, which is that I tweeted this morning just to be a little bit, to shiv some people. I see many Republican commentators, Krystal, who are so willing to Trump and candidate quality and all that.
Yeah.
What about abortion? I mean,
They
clearly,
don't wanna talk about that.
Oh, they don't want to talk about it at all. It is clear as day to me that abortion was one of the biggest deciding factors for the Democratic base for many people who showed up to vote. Number two, the emerging GOP coalition that people were so excited about did not materialize in nearly the same way. Yes, turnout was very high. We were talking this morning. Myra Flores lost down in South Texas. She also was saying, talking about the red wave did not materialize. Beto ended up winning many of those South Texas districts. So
yeah, I mean, he lost overall, but we've been covering how much the Rio Grande Valley has shifted.
Exactly.
They shifted back significantly last night, and Henry Cuellar, who also represents the district down there, won, I think, pretty easily. Like you said, Myra Flores ends up losing. That ends up being a Dem pickup in that region, and then even Beto at the top of the ticket as governor wins back, outperforms in Rio Grande Valley.
So clearly the takeaway is that GOP in disarray for once. The row your vote strategy actually did work phenomenally well
give them credit.
for the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
But let's not take away an extraordinary event. Florida is now a red state, and not just like kind of red, like red. Ron DeSantis won by 20 points. Marco Rubio similarly won by
like
17 points.
Yeah.
Extraordinary showing for Republicans in Florida, solidly in the GOP column now. And we have a totally shifting map. And I think this is going to be the ultimate war for the quote unquote narrative.
Yeah.
Was it candidate quality? Was it abortion? And was it Trump? So unfortunately, we can't say it's just one thing. I think it's multifaceted in many ways. Extraordinary that Pennsylvania gets called almost immediately. I sent an analysis this morning, Krystal, which shows that John Fetterman is on track to win Pennsylvania by a larger percentage point than Joe Biden in 2020, Trump or Toomey in 2016. Why is that extraordinary? One of the data points that you and I were pointing to last night was that early exit polls, of which we were both extraordinarily dubious, showed that abortion was at the very top of the ticket, top of mind, even more so than inflation in the state of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
I'm also finding a lot of interest in the fact that the Wisconsin governor's race goes Republican. Michigan, by the way, for the first time in 20 years, is set to have Democratic control of government all the way up and down the legislature and for the governor. So it is clear, given also the ballot initiatives we'll talk about with respect to abortion, I don't think we can understate how much of an impact that it had on the election last night.
Yeah, I mean, the two big obvious things are, number one, abortion.
Yes.
And number two, Trump and election denial really saddling the Republican Party. I mean, when we talk about the governor's races, there is so far one candidate who might win a governor's mansion, and that would be Kari Lake, who is an election denier. Every single one of the other ones lost.
Yep.
This was an albatross around the neck, not just of the extremist Republican candidates, but it really was a stench across the entire party. And, some of the candidates that performed the most poorly, like Dr. Oz, were Donald Trump picks.
Absolutely.
Down in Georgia, Raphael Warnock now with an edge, now probably going to a runoff where I would say he's favored to win, but we'll wait and see what the national environment is there. But, Trump picked a very weak candidate in Herschel Walker, who dramatically underperformed Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger, who were running statewide as well. But there are some other factors here that I think are really interesting too, especially when you look at the regional variation. So Li Fang tweeted this morning, which I thought was an interesting point. He said, Biden, the Democrats really outperformed in the Midwest last night. Mm-hmm. So if you think about Pennsylvania, if you think about Michigan, even in Ohio, there were some, obviously Tim Ryan didn't win, J.D. Vance ends up winning, but there were some surprise flips in congressional districts in Ohio, one of which no one even had on their radar. They thought was a likely R, mm-hmm. and a Democrat ends up winning it. You had strong Democratic performance in Wisconsin as well. And Li Fang points out, listen, Biden did way more to bring back trade from China, invest in post-industrial states with new money for manufacturing, and shore up local governance than Obama did in his first 2 years. Might be part of the reason Dems fared relatively well in Ohio, Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, et cetera. So I think the big picture trends, definitely Trump, repudiation of Trump, repudiation of stop the steal, conspiracy, election denying nonsense and extremism, and also extremism on abortion and other issues as well. But I really do think the election denial thing was a bridge too far for a lot of voters. But I do think you also have to point to some of the policy that Joe Biden enacted in office, in particular in that sparking Democratic enthusiasm. Young people are a big part of the story of what happened last night.
Absolutely.
They showed up for Democrats. There was a huge generational divide in terms of who people were voting for, young voters overwhelmingly for Democrats. To look at that and say, weed, student loan debt cancellation, that was probably really helpful there. That was a group where Biden was dramatically underwater until he took some of those actions. You look at the Midwest, you see the trade policy, you see the CHIPS Act, you see, continued smart trade initiatives with regard to China, and you say maybe that was part of the story there in the Midwest as well. So, the top layer is Trump, the top layer is abortion, but I do think underneath the surface, some of the regional variation has to do with some of the actual policy things that Biden enacted in office, which is kind of heartening that real things might actually matter.
I'm not so sure. I still think it's abortion. I think abortion was just so key in Wisconsin and Michigan, especially Michigan, where it was both on the ballot and it was at the state level. The gubernatorial candidate has so much impact, right, especially with control of the GOP legislature. You might be right. Listen, I hope you're right. But I'm not yet convinced.
Well, because before Biden started doing some stuff, his approval rating with the Democratic base was really kind of
It was low, and they came out to vote.
The big reason why this is different from other midterms, Republicans were energized.
Right.
They showed up. But Democrats were, if anything, even more energized. And then I haven't seen the independent numbers yet, but they must not have swung as hard to the right as pollsters were ultimately predicting.
Yeah.
So all of those things, abortion is certainly the spark, but I also think a Biden agenda that the Democratic base that was genuinely excited about and, affirmatively supportive of, Inflation Reduction Act, all of that coming, I think that also helped to shore up Democratic enthusiasm here. The other thing that I was thinking about is we've had so many election cycles where it just seemed like the laws of political gravity no longer applied. Basically, since Trump won office,
yes.
That just turned every conventional wisdom narrative about how politics functions and how people vote. It just turned it completely on its head. You're you can say grab them by the whatever, and you can still get elected and have all this fallout from all kinds of elites. You could still get elected. This was the first election where it felt like some of those rules of political gravity applied once again, where it was you know what? These people, I might not be in love with what the Democrats are doing, but these people have gone way too far, and I just can't go there with you. And it also marked the return of regional variation, which, especially in the Trump era, every one of these elections has been a national election, national election, national election. We both have been saying local politics is dead. It doesn't matter anymore. Last night it did matter, and that really marks a dramatic shift from the Trump era as well. as I said, Republicans really, if you just looked at Florida and New York, you'd be like, they had a pretty good night. In New York, I'm going to talk about this later, which amuses me greatly. It looks like Sean Patrick Maloney, who was the head of the DCCC, it looks like he may well lose his seat, and there's a whole lot to say about that as well. But, to your point about abortion, in New York, there wasn't a sense that abortion rights were really at risk because you still have a Democratic legislature. So even if you're sending Republican members of Congress, even if you consider voting for Lee Zeldin as governor, who ended up, losing pretty handily, but, even if you put some Republicans in, people didn't feel like their abortion rights were at risk. And I do think that's part of the story of why New York was better for Republicans.
And no, let's also not forget this. Ron DeSantis, he may be many things, but on abortion, he was only willing to go to 6 weeks. He never endorsed the national ban. And I think this is also something that really hurt some of the Senate candidates. So Herschel Walker, his own personal dalliances aside, I mean, Warnock was hammering him, saying if we have a GOP majority, they are going to pass, some national abortion ban. Obviously, Blake Masters didn't do himself any favor having that literally on his website at the time.
Yeah.
And look, let's talk about this. Masters right now is getting clobbered. Like, look, there's only 68% of the vote that is in, but he's running far behind Kari Lake, who is nearly neck and neck with Katie Hobbs in the same thing. Clearly, there was a lot of split ticket voting, and people did not like Blake Masters. That is a very interesting note, of which we can really only assume abortion had to be one of the major deciding ones. Combine that with the ballot initiatives in two or at least one red state and one purplish state, and we can say definitively that this was a massive, massive drag on the party. So I think those are my main takeaway on this, also from a meta level, like on the polling and everything, is we truly don't know anything. And that's very humbling, and I love it. I love being surprised by Americans. I was exactly like you. Frankly, I've just been cynical for the last 6 years. With Trump, like you said, I'm like, listen, man, people, look, you can do anything, and you can't get elected. Many of these stop the steal deniers, and even on abortion, people who were willing to go crazy out there, I was like, I just don't think it's going to matter in the context of inflation. But people surprise the hell out of us, and that was my main thing. Was obviously completely, I was wrong on the red wave. I truly assumed that inflation and all that would trump much more that inflation and all that would trump any concern on social or even stop the steal. And frankly, I'd be willing to empathize and understand with that position.
Yeah.
But clearly, it was not enough, and that is a really fascinating takeaway that I have not truly yet grappled with from our election.
I mean, there's a few things I'm thinking about here. First of all, Arizona is an interesting example because Kari Lake's position on abortion is indistinguishable from Blake Masters.
Right.
But she's just a much better candidate. And on the other side, the Democratic candidate, Katie Hobbs, very weak candidate. Mark Kelly, very strong candidate. So I think you just have on one hand, the candidate quality is Democrat is very strong and Republican is very weak, and it's exact opposite at the gubernatorial level. We still don't know the outcome of those races. It looks like Mark Kelly is going to hold on. If I had to guess, I'd say probably Kari Lake ends up winning, but that one is going to be really close and is not anywhere close to being called, and it's probably going to take days because that's just how they ultimately do things. But it is absolutely fascinating to watch all of this unfold. The pollsters got it wrong, but for the first time in several election cycles, it was Dem over performance, especially in the states of New Hampshire. Huge miss there. Huge miss. All of the polls leading up to Election Day were like, maybe Maggie Hassan by 1, maybe Don Bolduc by 1, maybe by 2. And then she blew out. I mean, she outperformed Biden in the state. It's not even close. Pennsylvania is the other one. Huge polling miss in the state of Pennsylvania. Now, some of these other states, the mainstream pollsters actually came pretty close. Like Georgia, looks like they came pretty close. Looks like Arizona, looks like Nevada, they came pretty close. And then this time it was the partisan right pollsters who were wildly off in some of these states. I mean, you had Trafalgar with Washington State Senate race, Patty Murray, as a toss-up. It looks like she's going to win by 14 points. Yeah. So, I mean, this is just, and they had a few like that where they were predicting toss-ups in places where Democrats are now going to win by 12, 13, 14 points. So, for them, they have a lot of egg on their face this morning in the same way that the mainstream pollsters did in 2020.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating, right? Because the pollsters got it completely wrong 2016, ish on 2018. If anything, there was some GOP overperformance. 2020, obviously, dead wrong once again. So that obviously that was my baked-in assumption. So I was listening to some of the takeaways. Nate Silver did like a snap reaction last night at like 2:30 or whatever in the morning, and he was like, "Look, here's the truth, which is that we have recency bias." N of 4, as in a sample size of 4 elections, actually not that big. So to have one be different than the other 3, if you take it in the context of the hundreds of elections that we have had in American history, that's actually not a very good data set. It's an important thing that we all need to remember. We had recency bias, I don't think unfairly, from 2016 to 2020.
I think what we looked at was, we were like, we don't really trust the polls.
Yes.
That was well-founded.
Yeah.
And so it's like, all right, well, if you can't rely on the polls, what are you going to rely on? And then you go, okay, well, the other thing you can look to that's not just like my gut feeling or my vibes is the fundamentals. The fundamentals were terrible for Democrats.
Right.
Biden's approval rating, history of if you're the party in power, the economic numbers, inflation, what people are telling people their number one issue ultimately is. And so when you look at that, you go, I mean, can all of that be overridden by candidate quality issues and abortion? Apparently the answer is yes. And I do think, for the Republicans, if they had run candidates who were basically plain vanilla Glenn Youngkin types across the country, they would be in a very different situation than they are in right now. On the inflation piece, I floated this last night, and it continues to be my best guess over why the economic numbers were not the weight around the Democrats that you would think that they would be. And I think it's because voters are kind of realistic about how much to blame, that the president ultimately is for what's going on in the economy. They look at this, they're like corporate profiteering, supply chain issues. We just had COVID, the whole world was turned upside down. So there's a little bit less blame directly of Biden's policies. And we saw that in some of the exit poll results. And then on the other hand, I think there was also, a miss from Republicans who thought they could just say inflation, inflation, inflation without being really specific about here's what we would do that would help you directly. And so they ended up not benefiting from that to the extent that they thought that they would ultimately.
Let me reiterate a point Ryan Grimm made last night, of which I am now forced to grapple with. I would have told you he was insane 48 hours ago. Was that, hey, we live in a crazy economy. Yeah, inflation is high, savings is really bad, all of that, but we have very low unemployment. So to have that low unemployment, it's a confounding variable. The Biden administration has been talking that way. I've frankly dismissed it as cope, given the savings rate going down, the way that people feel about it. But maybe it just doesn't hit the same to have high inflation and to have unemployment at 4. When let's say unemployment was at 10, I think it would have been right. It would have been different. It would have been the actual red wave could have materialized. So maybe that's something. Listen.
And gas prices still high.
Yeah, $3.80 right now.
A lot lower than they were before, though.
That's right. About 70 cents less than the overall peak. During all of this, man, there's so many meta takeaways. I'm also thinking about if the Democrats do hold the Senate, from a foreign policy perspective, we shouldn't forget the war in Ukraine. This basically just greenlit the blank check to Zelensky now for a long time. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
There's also on the House side, if the Dems do capture the House, keep the House, possible. Unlikely at this point. Let's say, 25% chance? Something like that. Then, look, what are they going to do? That's another good question.
I know.
By the way, nobody in Washington even knows the answer to that question.
Right now, it is still possible Republicans end up with control of the Senate by 1 seat.
Right.
It is also possible that, if not kind of likely, a little bit more likely than the Republicans ending up with a 1-seat margin, it's very possible Democrats end up with a 1-seat margin.
Well, the New York Times has it, majority of their needle right now says lean down in the Senate. Yeah.
Right. And so, of course, Democrats have the vice presidency, so they can have a 50-50 and have Kamala Harris as the tie-breaking vote, so they have an advantage there. Also, this could very well be coming down to another Georgia runoff.
Oh, God.
Could very well be coming down to that. Which I will say I predicted at one of our live shows. I did predict that.
You were right.
At least I will be able to take some comfort in feeling like I was right at some point during this process. But, the key is just to make a lot of different predictions, and then you can just be like, that one. That's
what I do.
The one I really
throw everything at the wall. I go, yeah, I think this, but here's all the caveats. Listen, I love being wrong about this because it's fun. I love seeing the vote totals. I love seeing the way that people vote. People are not reductive. They are multifaceted. I think they are their own people. I love America.
And it really does put a lot of pause into the narrative of realignment inevitability.
Absolutely.
Because we had a sequence of elections where it was like, all right, Latinos move a little more, Latinos move a little more. Oh, now we see black men moving a little bit this way. And that went in the other direction last night. So it also, Democrats used to have this very arrogant view of like, demographics are destiny, the coalition of the ascendant, as the Latino population grows, we're just gonna automatically benefit from that. And I think Republicans started to engage in a little bit of that same type of thinking of just like, inevitably, these groups are gonna continue moving our way. And, we don't really, it's just gonna happen. We don't really have to do anything like, economically, we don't really have to deliver for them. We're just like gonna fight the culture war and they're gonna fall into our hands. And, last night is a real warning sign for the Republicans on that front as well. So the question of what Democrats would do if they end up with the House and they end up with +1 in the Senate, that would be a really interesting one, because then you can take Joe Manchin off the table, or you can take Kirsten Sinema off the table, and you can, potentially do another reconciliation thing. But that's getting way ahead of where we are right now. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.